The Nightmire Blue paint had faded to a ghostly whisper of its former glory, but Mike Henderson could still see the beast that Eleanor once was. The 1967 Shelby GT500 sat motionless in the corner bay of Martinez Classic Restorations, surrounded by the scattered dreams of 6 different mechanics who had tried and failed to resurrect her thunderous heart. Chrome bumpers dulled by decades of neglect caught the afternoon light streaming through grimy windows, while the iconic white racing stripes told stories of speed that belonged to another era. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. For 8 months now, Elena Martinez had watched her best mechanics scratch their heads, curse under their breath, and eventually walk away from the most challenging restoration her shop had ever attempted. The engine block was cracked in ways that defied conventional repair, the transmission was seized solid, and every attempt to bring the legendary 428 Cobra Jet engine back to life had ended in expensive failure. 3 months ago, she should have told Mike Henderson the truth: some cars are beyond saving, some dreams are too broken to rebuild. But then something happened that would change everything. Mike's grandfather shuffled into the shop on a Tuesday morning, moving with the careful deliberation of a man whose 78-year-old bones had carried him through more battles than anyone suspected. Bob Henderson wore a faded flannel shirt, work boots that had seen better decades, and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime spent coaxing life from broken machinery. What nobody knew, what even his own family had never discovered, was that those hands had once performed miracles on the frozen battlefields of Korea, keeping M46 Patton tanks running when American lives depended on it. The moment Bob Henderson placed his palm against Eleanor's cold engine block, something shifted in the universe of that small Pennsylvania garage. He stood there for nearly 10 minutes, completely silent, his fingers tracing hairline fractures that had stumped master mechanics, his ear pressed against metal that had been declared dead beyond resurrection. Elena Martinez watched from across the shop, not understanding why this elderly man's presence filled her with an inexplicable sense of hope, why the impossible suddenly felt possible again. What happened next would shatter everything the automotive world thought it knew about restoration, reveal secrets that had been buried for 70 years, and prove that sometimes the most extraordinary expertise comes wrapped in the most ordinary packaging. This is the story of how a grandfather's hidden past saved his grandson's future, how wartime ingenuity conquered modern impossibility, and how the echo of tank treads on Korean soil would thunder once again through the heart of an American muscle car. Mike Henderson had been dreaming about Eleanor since he was 12 years old. Not the broken-down shell that now occupied Martinez Classic Restorations, but the pristine vision of automotive perfection that had lived in his imagination for over 2 decades. The 1967 Shelby GT500 represented everything he'd ever wanted: raw American power, classic design, and the kind of presence that turned heads at every intersection. Eleanor wasn't just a car, she was validation, achievement, and childhood fantasy rolled into 3,500 pounds of steel and chrome. The dream had started innocently enough. Young Mike had discovered a battered copy of Motor Trend magazine in his grandfather Bob's basement, its pages yellowed with age but its photographs still vivid with promise. The featured car was a Nightmire Blue Shelby GT500, captured mid-acceleration on some forgotten stretch of desert highway, white racing stripes cutting through the frame like lightning frozen in time. Something about that image had seized Mike's 12-year-old imagination and never let go. He'd stared at that photograph until he could close his eyes and see every detail. The aggressive hood scoop, the side exhaust pipes, the way the rear tires seemed to claw at the asphalt in desperate pursuit of velocity. 23 years later, Mike Henderson worked as a network systems administrator for a mid-sized insurance company in nearby Allentown, spending his days troubleshooting server problems and his evenings researching classic Shelby prices. The steady paycheck was comfortable but uninspiring, the kind of job that paid bills without feeding souls. His wife Lisa understood his automotive obsession with the patient tolerance of someone who'd heard countless stories about gear ratios and compression engines, who'd watched her husband's eyes light up every time a Shelby appeared on television, or rumbled past them on the highway. For 8 years, Mike had been saving methodically, consistently, relentlessly. $500 per month disappeared into a separate bank account marked Eleanor Fund, accumulating through discipline and sacrifice. Vacation money that could have taken them to beaches or mountains went instead toward his automotive dream. Christmas bonuses, tax refunds, even the occasional overtime pay, all found their way into the growing fund that would eventually resurrect his childhood fantasy. The opportunity had arrived 6 months ago through a classified ad that seemed too good to be true. A 1967 Shelby GT500, original 428 Cobra Jet engine, stored in a barn outside Millbrook for 35 years. The seller was an elderly widow, whose late husband had been a mechanic himself, a man who'd rescued the Shelby from a junkyard with grand plans for restoration that time had never allowed him to complete. The asking price was exactly what Mike had saved, $42,000 for a car that would be worth twice that amount once properly restored. Mike had driven to the barn on a crisp October morning, his heart pounding with anticipation and terror in equal measure. The seller, Miss Ruth Davidson, was a soft-spoken woman in her 70s, who moved with the careful grace of someone who'd spent decades as a mechanic's wife. She understood the language of broken dreams and deferred maintenance, the way hope could rust as thoroughly as any metal component. The barn itself was a cathedral of automotive archaeology, filled with parts cars, forgotten projects, and the accumulated debris of a lifetime spent believing that everything broken could eventually be fixed. Eleanor sat beneath a canvas tarp that had protected her from decades of Pennsylvania weather.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Outline mysterious and promising in the barn's dusty shadows. When Mrs. Davidson pulled away the covering, Mike felt his breath catch in his throat. The Nightmire Blue paint was faded but intact, the iconic racing stripes still visible beneath a coating of dust and time. Chrome bumpers showed surface rust but no serious corrosion, while the interior, though worn, retained the kind of authentic patina that money couldn't buy. This wasn't a pristine museum piece. This was exactly the kind of project that serious collectors dreamed about finding. The engine bay told a different story. The massive 428 Cobra Jet engine sat silent and suspicious, its various components showing the kind of neglect that transformed minor problems into major catastrophes. Oil had leaked from multiple seals, creating abstract patterns on the garage floor that spoke of decades without proper maintenance. The transmission felt solid when Mike attempted to shift through the gears, but solid in the way that indicated complete seizure rather than mechanical integrity. Still, the fundamentals were there: original engine, original transmission, original body panels that could be restored to their former glory. Mike had handed over his check without hesitation, signed the title transfer with hands that trembled slightly with excitement, and arranged for Eleanor to be transported to Martinez Classic Restorations the following week. Elena Martinez had an excellent reputation throughout the region for bringing dead muscle cars back to life, and her shop had successfully completed dozens of similar projects over the past decade. The estimate had been optimistic: $12,000 to $15,000 for a complete mechanical restoration, 6 to 8 weeks for completion. Mike had nodded eagerly, already imagining himself behind Eleanor's wheel for the Millbrook Classic Car Show in November. That optimism had died quickly and expensively. Eleanor's first assessment revealed problems that went far beyond normal restoration challenges. The engine block had hairline cracks that traditional welding couldn't address, stress fractures that had developed over decades of temperature cycling and mechanical neglect. The crankshaft was scored beyond normal machine shop repair, while the transmission case showed internal damage that suggested catastrophic failure at some point in the car's history. What had seemed like a straightforward restoration had evolved into a complete mechanical reconstruction. Tommy Chen, Eleanor's best engine specialist, had spent 3 weeks attempting various repair strategies. He'd consulted with machine shops throughout Pennsylvania, researched specialized welding techniques, even contacted restoration experts in California, who dealt with high-end Shelby projects. Every solution was either prohibitively expensive, technically impossible, or both. The engine block's casting was unique to the 428 Cobra Jet, making replacement parts nearly impossible to locate, while the specific metallurgy required for successful repairs exceeded the capabilities of most commercial facilities. Jake Williams, the shop's transmission expert, had delivered equally discouraging news. The top-loader 4-speed transmission had suffered internal damage that required complete rebuilding with parts that were no longer manufactured. The case itself showed stress fractures similar to those plaguing the engine block, suggesting that Eleanor's problems were systemic rather than isolated. Every component seemed to have failed in concert, creating a puzzle that defied conventional restoration approaches. Elena Martinez had built her reputation on accepting challenges that other shops wouldn't touch, but Eleanor was testing the limits of even her considerable expertise. The Shelby sat in Bay 3 like an automotive sphinx, guarding secrets that seemed determined to remain hidden. Customer after customer walked past the motionless muscle car, some offering unsolicited advice, others shaking their heads in sympathy. The local automotive community had begun referring to Eleanor as the car that broke Martinez, a reputation that stung Elena's professional pride more than any financial loss. Mike visited the shop every Saturday morning, a ritual that had become increasingly painful as weeks turned into months without progress. He would stand beside Eleanor, running his hands along her faded paint, trying to reconcile his childhood dreams with the harsh reality of mechanical impossibility. Lisa had stopped accompanying him on these visits, understanding that her husband needed to process his disappointment privately, to grieve for ambitions that might never be realized. The financial pressure was mounting steadily. Mike's Eleanor fund had been exhausted months ago, replaced by credit card debt and a second mortgage that Lisa had agreed to reluctantly. The medical bills from her recent surgery had added another layer of stress to their financial situation, making Eleanor's restoration both more important and more impossible with each passing week. The Millbrook Classic Car Show represented more than just automotive glory. The first-place prize of $25,000 could resolve their immediate financial crisis and validate 8 years of patient saving. Bob Henderson had been watching his grandson struggle with the quiet concern of someone who understood the weight of deferred dreams. The elderly man had spent 40 years working as a civilian mechanic after his military service, building a reputation for solving problems that stumped younger, more formally trained technicians. His own garage behind the house on Maple Street was filled with tools that most modern mechanics had never seen. Specialized equipment that spoke of an era when repairs were accomplished through ingenuity, rather than replacement parts. But Bob had never mentioned his military service to anyone, including his own family. The memories of Korea were buried beneath decades of silence, wrapped in shame and survivor's guilt, that had shaped his civilian life in ways that even Dorothy, his wife of 52 years, didn't fully understand. The tank maintenance skills that had kept American armored units operational during some of the war's bloodiest battles had been deliberately forgotten, abandoned like worn-out equipment that served no purpose in peacetime. The Tuesday morning when Bob finally decided to visit Martinez Classic Restorations marked the end of 70 years of silence. He'd watched Mike's enthusiasm slowly transforming to despair, seen the financial stress affecting his grandson's marriage, understood that Eleanor represented far more than automotive restoration. The decision to intervene hadn't been easy. It required confronting memories that had been carefully suppressed, acknowledging expertise that he'd spent decades denying. Elena Martinez had been surprised to see the elderly man enter her shop that morning. Bob Henderson moved with the deliberate care of someone whose balance wasn't quite what it used to be, but his eyes held an alertness that suggested mental faculties remained sharp, despite his advancing age. He'd introduced himself simply as Mike's grandfather, explaining that he wanted to take a look at the car that had been causing his grandson so much trouble. What happened next would challenge everything Elena thought she knew about automotive restoration. Bob approached Eleanor with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious ceremonies, his weathered hands exploring the engine bay with a familiarity that seemed impossible. He didn't speak for nearly 10 minutes, simply listening, feeling, absorbing information through senses that had been trained under circumstances that modern mechanics couldn't imagine. When Bob finally straightened up and turned to face Elena, His expression had changed completely. The uncertain elderly man who'd entered her shop had been replaced by someone who radiated quiet confidence, whose posture suggested knowledge that went far deeper than casual automotive interest. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, like watching a mask slip away to reveal the person who'd been hidden underneath all along. "This engine can be saved," Bob said quietly, his voice carrying a certainty that made Elena's pulse quicken with unexpected hope. "But not with any techniques your people have been trying. The metallurgy is different from civilian applications. The stress patterns require approaches that aren't taught in modern schools. I might be able to help, but I'll need to do things my own way." Elena had heard plenty of confident predictions from well-meaning amateurs over the years, but something about Bob Henderson's demeanor suggested that his confidence wasn't based on optimism or wishful thinking. The way he'd examined Eleanor's engine spoke of experience that went far beyond weekend hobby mechanics, knowledge that had been earned under circumstances that left permanent impressions on both metal and memory. The question now wasn't whether Bob Henderson could deliver on his quiet promise, but whether he was prepared to confront the ghosts that successful restoration would inevitably awaken. Bob Henderson's morning routine had remained unchanged for the better part of 2 decades. He woke at 5:30 sharp, made coffee in the same chipped ceramic mug Dorothy had given him for Christmas in 1978, and settled into his worn leather recliner to read the Millbrook Gazette from cover to cover. The newspaper rarely contained surprises anymore, the same local politics, the same community events, the same obituaries of people he'd grown up with but hadn't spoken to in years. After the paper, he would shuffle to his workshop behind the house, where he maintained an impressive collection of tools that most mechanics would envy, but few would recognize. The workshop was Bob's sanctuary, a place where he could tinker without explanation or observation. Vintage wrenches hung in precise rows on pegboard walls, their chrome surfaces polished to mirror brightness despite their age. Hand-forged specialty tools occupied honored positions in custom-built drawers, each one a reminder of problems solved decades ago when replacement parts weren't available, and improvisation meant the difference between life and death. A 1952 Snap-on toolbox dominated one corner, its red paint faded but its drawers sliding with the smooth precision that only quality engineering could provide. Dorothy understood that the workshop served purposes beyond simple mechanical maintenance. In 52 years of marriage, she'd learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when her husband needed solitude to wrestle with memories he couldn't or wouldn't share. The gentle tapping of hammers against metal, the soft whir of the bench grinder, the satisfied grunt that accompanied successful repairs. These sounds had become the soundtrack of their retirement, a familiar rhythm that provided comfort without requiring explanation. Their daily conversations rarely strayed beyond immediate concerns: grocery lists, doctor appointments, the weather forecast that would determine whether Bob spent his afternoon in the workshop or reading in his chair. Dorothy had long ago stopped asking about his time in Korea, understanding that some experiences created walls that love couldn't breach, secrets that protected both the keeper and the kept from truths too heavy for civilian life to accommodate. She knew Bob had been a tank mechanic, knew he'd served with distinction, but the details remained locked behind a silence that had become as much a part of their marriage as shared meals and comfortable routines. The neighborhood on Maple Street reflected the kind of stable, working-class community that had defined Millbrook for generations. Houses built in the 1960s and 1970s lined the tree-shaded avenue, their modest ranch and colonial designs, speaking of an era when American prosperity seemed both achievable and sustainable. Bob and Dorothy's neighbors were mostly retirees now, people who'd worked in the steel mill or the automotive parts factory before those industries abandoned Pennsylvania for cheaper labor markets overseas. They waved from their front porches, exchanged pleasantries about the weather, and maintained the kind of superficial friendliness that characterized small-town life. Mike and Lisa lived 6 blocks away in a newer development, their 2-story colonial, representing the kind of upward mobility that previous generations had taken for granted. Mike's job in network administration provided steady income and health benefits, while Lisa's work as a registered nurse at Millbrook General contributed both financial stability and professional satisfaction. They visited Bob and Dorothy every Sunday for dinner, a regime that had continued uninterrupted since their wedding 8 years ago. These gatherings followed predictable patterns: Dorothy's pot-roast conversations about work and neighborhood gossip, Mike's inevitable updates about his automotive projects. Bob had always encouraged his grandson's mechanical interests, recognizing in Mike the same fascination with engines and transmissions that had driven his own career choices decades earlier. The garage behind Mike's house contained a respectable collection of tools and equipment, though nothing approaching the specialized inventory that Bob maintained in his own workshop. Mike's projects tended towards straightforward maintenance and minor modifications, the kind of work that provided satisfaction without requiring the deeper knowledge that came from years of professional experience under challenging conditions. The decision to purchase Eleanor had surprised Bob more than he'd let on. Mike's previous automotive enthusiasms had focused on practical vehicles that could be improved without enormous financial risk. A 1985 Camaro C28 that he'd modified with aftermarket performance parts, a 1970 Chevelle that required mostly cosmetic restoration, projects that matched his skill level and budget constraints. The Shelby GT500 represented a quantum leap in complexity and expense, the kind of restoration that challenged even professional shops with decades of experience. Bob had kept his concerns to himself during Mike's initial excitement about the barn find. The photographs Mike had shown him revealed the classic warning signs of a project that would consume far more time and money than initial estimates suggested, but Bob understood that some lessons could only be learned through direct experience. He'd offered gentle advice about budgeting for unexpected problems, suggested that Mike establish realistic timelines for completion, but ultimately supported his grandson's dream with the kind of quiet encouragement that had carried relationships since Mike was old enough to hold a wrench. The weekly updates about Eleanor's restoration had grown increasingly discouraging as months passed without significant progress. Bob listened to Mike's frustrated explanations about cracked engine blocks and seized transmissions, nodded sympathetically at stories about failed repair attempts and mounting costs, but avoided offering specific technical advice that might reveal the depth of his own knowledge. The line between helpful grandfather and intrusive expert was one that Bob had learned to navigate carefully over the years, understanding that unsolicited expertise could damage relationships as effectively as mechanical failures damaged engines. Dorothy had been the first to suggest that Bob might be able to help with Eleanor's problems. Her comment had been casual, delivered during one of Mike's particularly discouraged updates about the shop's latest failed attempt at engine block repair. Bob had deflected the suggestion with characteristic modesty, claiming that his experience with civilian vehicles wouldn't apply to the complex problems that were stumping professional restoration experts. The deflection had been automatic, a reflexive protection of secrets that had shaped his civilian identity for 7 decades. But privately Bob had found himself thinking more and more about Eleanor's problems. The symptoms Mike described: hairline cracks in cast iron, stress fractures that defied conventional repair, metallurgical challenges that exceeded modern machine shop capabilities. These were issues that Bob had encountered before, under circumstances that civilian mechanics couldn't imagine. The M46 patent tanks he'd maintained in Korea had faced similar problems, equipment failures that required innovative solutions when replacement parts weren't available, and field conditions demanded immediate repairs. The memories Bob had spent decades suppressing began stirring with uncomfortable persistence. Frozen Korean mornings when tank engines refused to start, desperate midnight repairs under enemy artillery, the constant pressure of knowing that mechanical failure could mean death for entire crews. These experiences had taught him approaches to metallurgy and engine repair that civilian training never covered, techniques that were born from necessity rather than textbook theory.
knowledge that he'd deliberately abandoned when he returned to Pennsylvania in 1953, tools and skills that he'd buried beneath 40 years of routine automotive maintenance. The decision to visit Martinez Classic Restorations hadn't been easy. It required confronting not just technical challenges but emotional ones as well. Bob understood that successful intervention would inevitably lead to questions about his background, explanations that would reveal aspects of his military service that he'd kept hidden from his own family. The comfortable anonymity of retirement would be replaced by unwanted attention, recognition that he'd spent his civilian life actively avoiding. But watching Mike's growing desperation had finally overcome Bob's reluctance to emerge from the shadows of his own past. The financial pressure Lisa's medical bills had created, combined with the approaching deadline of the Millbrook Classic Car Show, meant that Eleanor's restoration had evolved from hobby project to family crisis. The $25,000 first prize represented more than automotive glory. It was a potential solution to problems that threatened the financial stability. More importantly, Bob recognized in his grandson's obsession with Eleanor something that went deeper than simple automotive enthusiasm. The Shelby represented validation, achievement, proof that childhood dreams could survive the compromises of adult responsibility. Mike's 8 years of methodical saving, his willingness to risk financial security for the chance to own and restore his dream car. These actions spoke of the kind of dedication that Bob had once applied to keeping American armor operational under impossible conditions. The parallel wasn't lost on Bob, just as he'd once fought to resurrect damaged tanks that other mechanics had declared beyond repair. Mike was now struggling to save a car that professional restoration experts had written off as impossible. The difference was that Bob possessed knowledge that could tip the balance, skills that had been earned through trial by fire during one of America's forgotten conflicts. The question was whether he could access that knowledge without awakening memories that had taken decades to suppress. Bob's workshop contained evidence of capabilities that even Doherty didn't fully understand. Specialty measuring tools that could detect stress fractures invisible to normal inspection, welding equipment modified with techniques that weren't taught in civilian schools, metallurgical testing devices that most modern shops had never seen. These tools represented the accumulated knowledge of someone who'd learned to repair the irreparable under conditions that demanded success regardless of available resources. The morning Bob decided to drive to Martinez Classic Restorations, he spent an extra hour in his workshop running his hands over tools that hadn't been used for their intended purposes in decades. The familiar weight of precision instruments brought back muscle memory that 40 years of civilian life hadn't entirely erased, reminders of skills that had once been essential for survival, but had become dangerous secrets in peacetime. He understood that using these capabilities would require explanations that he wasn't prepared to give, but Mike's need had finally overcome his own reluctance to confront the past. Part 3 Hints of Hidden Depths. The first indication that Bob Henderson possessed knowledge beyond normal automotive experience came during his second visit to Martinez Classic Restorations. Elena Martinez had initially dismissed his confident assessment of Eleanor's problems as the optimism of a well-meaning amateur, but Bob's return 3 days later with a collection of diagnostic tools she'd never seen suggested that her first impression might have been incomplete. The equipment he
carried wasn't available through normal automotive supply channels, and the casual way he handled obviously expensive precision instruments spoke of familiarity that extended far beyond weekend hobby mechanics. Tommy Chen had been attempting to measure the extent of Eleanor's engine block damage using conventional methods when Bob approached with what appeared to be a custom-modified ultrasonic thickness gauge. The device looked similar to equipment Tommy had seen in high-end machine shops, but the modifications were unlike anything he'd encountered in 15 years of professional restoration work. Bob's explanation of the instrument's capabilities was both technically sophisticated and deliberately vague, suggesting knowledge that he wasn't entirely comfortable revealing. "The conventional approach you're using will miss fractures that are still developing," Bob explained quietly, his weathered hands positioning the modified gauge with obvious expertise. "Cast iron fails in patterns that most civilian mechanics never see, stress concentrations that require different detection methods. The cracks you've found are just the visible symptoms of deeper structural problems." Eleanor watched from across the shop as Bob systematically examined Eleanor's engine block with equipment and techniques that challenged her understanding of standard diagnostic procedures. His movements were economical and precise, suggesting training that went beyond casual familiarity with the tools he was using. More intriguingly, his examination revealed damage patterns that her own mechanics had missed. Hairline fractures that weren't visible under normal inspection, but became obvious when Bob pointed them out using methods that none of her staff understood. The implications were disturbing on multiple levels. If Bob's assessment was accurate, Eleanor's problems were far more extensive than anyone had realized, requiring repair approaches that exceeded the capabilities of conventional restoration techniques. But more puzzling was the question of where a retired civilian mechanic had acquired knowledge of metallurgical analysis that seemed more appropriate to military or aerospace applications than automotive restoration. Jake Williams had been skeptical of Bob's involvement until the elderly man began examining Eleanor's transmission with the same systematic precision he'd applied to the engine block. Bob's questions about the transmission's failure patterns revealed understanding of internal mechanics that went beyond normal automotive experience. Technical knowledge that suggested exposure to equipment that civilian mechanics rarely encountered. His assessment of the damage was both more optimistic and more complex than Jake's own analysis, proposing repair strategies that were theoretically sound but practically challenging to implement. The case fractures follow stress lines that indicate sudden shock loading rather than gradual wear, Bob observed, running his fingers along cracks that Jake had assumed were the result of normal age and neglect. This kind of failure pattern suggests the transmission was subjected to forces that exceeded its design limits, probably during a single catastrophic event rather than accumulated damage over time. Jake had reached similar conclusions about the nature of Eleanor's transmission failure, but Bob's analysis included details that Jake had missed and repair approaches that Jake had never considered. The elderly man's suggestion that the case could be successfully welded using techniques that weren't taught in normal automotive programs was both intriguing and puzzling, implying knowledge of metallurgical procedures that most restoration shops couldn't perform. More mysteriously, Bob seemed to understand the root causes of Eleanor's mechanical failures in ways that suggested experience with similar problems under different circumstances. His explanations of why conventional repair methods had failed were technically accurate, but included references to stress conditions and operating environments that didn't match typical civilian vehicle usage. Eleanor began to suspect that Bob's automotive knowledge had been acquired under circumstances that her retired mechanic explanation couldn't adequately account for.
That his grandfather possessed knowledge that went far beyond typical automotive experience was both exciting and unsettling. Mike had always known that Bob was unusually skilled with mechanical repairs, but the precision instruments and sophisticated diagnostic techniques that Bob was applying to Eleanor's problems suggested expertise that seemed almost supernatural compared to normal civilian capabilities. The transformation of his modest grandfather into someone who could diagnose complex metallurgical problems that had stumped professional restoration experts was difficult to reconcile with Mike's understanding of Bob's background. More puzzling were Bob's occasional comments that seemed to reference experiences that didn't match his claimed civilian career. Brief mentions of working under extreme time pressure, casual references to equipment that wasn't used in typical automotive applications, offhand remarks about problem-solving approaches that seemed more appropriate to military or industrial situations than civilian garage work. These comments were always brief and quickly deflected when Mike asked for clarification, but they accumulated into a pattern that suggested Bob's past included experiences that he wasn't willing to discuss. Elena's conversations with other restoration professionals in the region yielded additional confirmation that Bob's capabilities were unusual. Shop owners who'd been in business for decades claimed they'd never encountered diagnostic techniques or repair approaches similar to what Bob was demonstrating, while parts suppliers were unable to identify sources for the specialized equipment that Bob was using. The consensus among experienced restoration experts was that Bob's knowledge had been acquired through training and experience that wasn't available through normal civilian channels. The most intriguing aspect of Bob's involvement was his obvious familiarity with the specific types of problems that were plaguing Eleanor's restoration. His immediate recognition of the engine block's stress fracture patterns, his accurate assessment of the transmission's failure modes, his confident predictions about which repair approaches would succeed or fail, all suggested previous experience with similar problems under circumstances that civilian mechanics typically didn't encounter. Elena began to suspect that Bob's past included exposure to equipment and conditions that had provided knowledge directly applicable to Eleanor's unique challenges. Bob's reluctance to discuss the source of his expertise only deepened the mystery. His deflections when asked about his background were polite but firm, suggesting that he preferred to focus on present solutions rather than past experiences. The careful way he avoided specific details about his military service, his evasive responses to questions about where he'd learned his diagnostic techniques, his obvious discomfort when conversation turned to the source of his specialized equipment, these behaviors suggested that Bob was protecting secrets that went deeper than simple modesty about his capabilities. The workshop behind Bob's house provided additional evidence of hidden depths. Elena's single visit to Bob's personal workspace had revealed an impressive collection of tools and equipment that seemed more appropriate to industrial or military applications than civilian automotive work. Precision measuring instruments that most shops couldn't afford, specialized welding equipment that wasn't available through normal supply channels, diagnostic devices that suggested access to resources that typical mechanics didn't possess. The consensus among experienced restoration experts was that Bob's knowledge had been acquired through training and experience that wasn't available through normal civilian channels. As Eleanor's restoration progressed under Bob's guidance, the evidence of his hidden expertise continued to accumulate. His ability to predict which repair approaches would succeed, his familiarity with metallurgical techniques that most shops had never attempted, his casual references to problem-solving methods that seemed more appropriate to emergency field repairs than civilian restoration work, all pointed to background and training that Bob wasn't willing to discuss openly. Part 4. The Catalyst Event. The morning that would change everything began with Mike Henderson's phone call to his grandfather at 6:15, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Elena Martinez had just informed him that Eleanor's engine block damage was more extensive than anyone had initially realized, that the stress fractures Bob had identified were part of a systematic failure that rendered conventional restoration approaches completely inadequate. The machine shop in Allentown that had been Elena's last hope for engine block repair had examined Bob's detailed damage assessment and concluded that Eleanor's 428 Cobra Jet engine was beyond salvation using any commercially available techniques. "Grandpa, I need to ask you something directly. Elena says you found problems with Eleanor that none of her mechanics could detect, that you're using equipment and techniques that go way beyond normal automotive work. She thinks you might have knowledge that could save this project, but she also thinks you're not telling us everything about where that knowledge comes from." Bob Henderson stood in his kitchen, still wearing the flannel pajamas that had become his uniform for early morning phone calls. Feeling the weight of 70 years of carefully maintained secrets pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. Through the window, he could see his workshop building, where tools and equipment that represented a lifetime of hidden expertise waited in the darkness for decisions he'd been avoiding since 1953. The moment he'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure had finally arrived. The intersection of past capabilities and present need that would force him to choose between continued anonymity and family obligation. "Mike, some things are complicated to explain," Bob replied carefully, his voice carrying the measured tone that Dorothy had learned to recognize as evidence of internal struggle. "What I can tell you is that I might be able to help with Eleanor's problems, but it would require using approaches that aren't typical for civilian restoration. The question is whether you're prepared to trust me
To do things my own way, even if I can't fully explain why those methods will work." The pause that followed stretched long enough for Bob to hear his own heartbeat, the steady rhythm that had carried him through frozen Korean winters and decades of civilian anonymity. Mike's breathing was audible through the phone connection, the sound of someone calculating risks and benefits while drowning in options that had already been exhausted. Bob understood that his grandson was facing the kind of decision that would define not just Eleanor's fate, but the trajectory of his marriage, his financial future, and his relationship with childhood dreams that had become adult obsessions. "What do you need from me?" Mike asked finally, his voice carrying the resignation of someone who'd run out of conventional alternatives. "Eleanor says the car show is 3 weeks away, that if we're going to attempt something different, it has to happen now. The shop can't afford to keep Eleanor tied up much longer, and Lisa and I can't afford to keep throwing money at failed repairs. If you think you can do something that professional restoration experts can't, I'm willing to listen." Bob closed his eyes, feeling the familiar sensation of bridges burning behind him as he stepped across lines that had defined his civilian identity for 7 decades. The decision to emerge from the shadows of his own past carried consequences that extended far beyond Eleanor's mechanical problems, implications that would reshape his relationships with family members who'd never suspected the depth of knowledge he'd been hiding. Once he demonstrated capabilities that civilian training couldn't explain, the questions would begin, and some questions had answers that couldn't be contained within comfortable family narratives. "I'll need complete access to Eleanor and the shop's facilities," Bob said, his voice gaining strength as he committed to a course of action that felt both terrifying and inevitable. "Eleanor's mechanics will have to step back and let me work without interference, even if my methods seem unconventional. Most importantly, you'll need to trust that I know what I'm doing, even when I can't fully explain the reasoning behind my approaches." The conversation that followed involved logistics and timelines, but its real significance lay in what wasn't discussed. Bob didn't explain where he'd learned techniques that could repair metallurgical damage that stumped professional machine shops, didn't reveal the source of equipment that wasn't available through civilian channels, didn't discuss the experiences that had taught him to solve problems under conditions that civilian mechanics never encountered. Mike didn't press for details that his grandfather was obviously reluctant to provide, understanding that some explanations would come when Bob was ready to offer them, if he ever was. Elena Martinez's reaction to Bob's request for complete control over Eleanor's restoration was a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief because her shop's reputation couldn't afford another high-profile failure. Apprehension because turning Eleanor over to an amateur mechanic whose methods she didn't understand represented a professional risk that could damage relationships with other customers. The decision to grant Bob unrestricted access to her facility and equipment was based more on desperation than confidence, a calculation that conventional approaches had already failed and unconventional ones couldn't make the situation significantly worse. "I want to be clear about expectations," Elena told Bob during their private conversation about the arrangement. "Eleanor has been in my shop for 8 months without significant progress, and my reputation in the restoration community has suffered because of the failures. If you're going to attempt repairs using techniques that my mechanics don't understand, I need assurance that you're not going to make the problems worse, Bob's response was characteristically modest, but contained undertones of confidence that Elena found both reassuring and mysterious. His willingness to accept complete responsibility for Eleanor's fate, combined with his obvious familiarity with the specific challenges that had defeated professional restoration efforts, suggested that his confidence wasn't based on optimism or wishful thinking. Something in Bob's demeanor implied that he understood Eleanor's problems from perspectives that Elena's mechanics hadn't considered. Knowledge that had been acquired under circumstances that civilian training didn't cover. The transformation of Martinez Classic Restorations began the following Monday morning, when Bob arrived at the shop with a pickup truck loaded with equipment that none of Elena's mechanics had seen before. Precision measuring instruments, specialized welding apparatus, metallurgical testing devices, and hand tools that appeared to be custom modifications of standard automotive equipment. The total value of Bob's personal toolkit exceeded the equipment budget of most professional restoration shops, representing an investment in capability that seemed disproportionate to typical civilian mechanical work. Tommy Chan and Jake Williams watched with growing amazement as Bob systematically arranged his equipment around Eleanor's work area, transforming Bay 3 from a conventional restoration space into something that resembled a specialized manufacturing facility. The precision instruments Bob deployed were calibrated to tolerances that typical automotive work didn't require, while the diagnostic equipment included capabilities that most shops couldn't afford. More intriguingly, Bob's obvious familiarity with expensive precision tools suggested training and experience that went beyond normal civilian automotive work. "Where did you learn to use equipment like this?" Tommy asked, his professional curiosity overcoming his initial skepticism about Bob's involvement. "Some of these instruments look like they belong in aerospace manufacturing or military applications, rather than automotive restoration." Bob's deflection was polite but firm, focusing attention on Eleanor's problems rather than the source of his diagnostic capabilities. His examination of the engine block using equipment that Tommy had never seen revealed damage patterns that conventional inspection methods had missed, stress concentrations that explained why previous repair attempts had failed. More significantly, Bob's analysis suggested repair approaches that were theoretically sound but practically challenging to implement using normal restoration techniques. The first indication that Bob's capabilities extended far beyond typical civilian mechanical work came when he began preparing Eleanor's engine block for repairs that Elena's mechanics had declared impossible. His assessment of the metallurgical challenges was both more complex and more optimistic than professional machine shop
evaluations proposing solutions that required techniques that weren't taught in normal automotive training programs. The precision instruments Bob used to map stress patterns and plan repair strategies were operated with expertise that suggested extensive previous experience with similar problems under different circumstances. Jake Williams' skepticism about Bob's unconventional approach began to dissolve when the elderly man demonstrated diagnostic techniques that revealed transmission problems that conventional inspection had missed. Bob's understanding of failure patterns that weren't visible using standard methods, combined with his accurate predictions about which repair strategies would succeed or fail, suggested knowledge that had been acquired through direct experience with similar problems under conditions that civilian mechanics typically didn't encounter. More puzzling were Bob's occasional references to time constraints and resource limitations that didn't match typical civilian restoration work. His comments about working under extreme pressure, his casual mentions of field repair techniques, his obvious familiarity with improvised solutions that used non-standard materials. These elements suggested that Bob's mechanical expertise had been developed under circumstances that civilian training didn't cover. Elena's growing realization that Bob possessed capabilities that exceeded anything she'd encountered in 25 years of professional restoration work was both exciting and unsettling.
The transformation of Eleanor from impossible project to potentially salvageable restoration was occurring through methods that Elena didn't understand, using techniques that challenged her assumptions about what was possible within civilian automotive capabilities. Bob's obvious expertise was undeniable, but its source remained mysteriously hidden behind deflections and evasions that suggested knowledge acquired under circumstances that weren't compatible with normal civilian mechanical training. The catalyst event that would force Bob to reveal the true extent of his hidden capabilities was still approaching, but the foundation for revelation had been established. Eleanor's restoration under Bob's guidance was proceeding in ways that defied conventional understanding, using techniques that suggested training and experience that extended far beyond typical civilian automotive work. The questions that Elena, Tommy, and Jake were asking about Bob's background were becoming increasingly difficult to deflect, while the evidence of his hidden expertise continued to accumulate with each successful repair that professional restoration experts had declared impossible. Part 5. Initial resistance and conflict. The resistance to Bob Henderson's unconventional restoration methods emerged gradually, building from professional skepticism into open hostility as the elderly man's techniques challenged fundamental assumptions about automotive repair that Elena Martinez's mechanics had accepted throughout their careers. Tommy Chen, despite his initial amazement at Bob's diagnostic equipment, became increasingly vocal about repair approaches that seemed to violate basic metallurgical principles, while Jake Williams questioned whether Bob's proposed solutions were safe for long-term operation under the stress conditions that high-performance engines generated. The first major confrontation occurred when Bob announced his intention to repair Eleanor's cracked engine block using welding techniques that none of Elena's mechanics had encountered before. The hairline fractures that had defeated conventional repair methods required approaches that weren't taught in civilian automotive programs, metallurgical procedures that Bob described in terms that suggested military or aerospace applications rather than typical restoration work. Tommy's objections were based on legitimate technical concerns about weld penetration and heat-affected zone properties, but they also reflected professional pride that was threatened by an amateur's claims of superior knowledge. What you're proposing violates every principle of cast iron repair that I learned in 15 years of professional restoration, Tommy argued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd successfully completed dozens of similar projects. The preheating requirements alone would require equipment that we don't have, while the cooling procedures you're describing would take longer than our shop can afford to keep Eleanor tied up. More importantly, I'm not convinced that your welding approach will produce joints that can withstand the stress levels that 428 Cobra Jet engines generate under full power. Bob's response was characteristically patient, but revealed hints of knowledge that couldn't be easily dismissed. His explanation for why conventional repair methods had failed included technical details about stress propagation and thermal cycling that suggested understanding of metallurgical engineering principles that went beyond normal automotive training. More significantly, Bob's confidence in his proposed solutions wasn't based on theoretical knowledge, but appeared to reflect direct experience with similar problems under conditions that Tommy had never encountered. The conventional approaches your people have been trying are designed for normal civilian applications where replacement parts are readily available and cost isn't a primary concern. The techniques I'm proposing were developed for situations where failure wasn't acceptable and conventional solutions weren't available. The metallurgy is the same, but the approaches required are different when you can't simply order replacement components from a catalog. Elena Martinez found herself caught between professional responsibility and desperate hope as the conflict between Bob and her mechanics intensified. Her shop's reputation had already suffered from 8 months of failed attempts to restore Eleanor, while the approaching deadline of the Millbrook Classic Car Show added time pressure that made conventional solutions increasingly impractical. Bob's obvious expertise and sophisticated equipment suggested capabilities that could potentially save both Eleanor and Elena's professional standing. But his evasive explanations about his background raised questions about whether she could trust methods that her trained mechanics couldn't understand or verify. The tension escalated when Bob began modifying Elena's welding equipment with accessories that appeared to be custom manufactured for applications that weren't typical of civilian automotive work. His alterations to standard arc welding apparatus included precision gas flow controls and temperature monitoring systems that Tommy recognized as similar to equipment
Used in high-end aerospace manufacturing, modifications that suggested access to resources that civilian mechanics typically couldn't afford. Bob's casual familiarity with expensive precision accessories implied training and experience that weren't compatible with his claimed background as a retired civilian mechanic. Jake Williams's resistance to Bob's transmission repair proposals was based on equally legitimate concerns about unconventional approaches that seemed to ignore established industry practices. The elderly man's suggestion that Eleanor's top-loader 4-speed could be successfully rebuilt using techniques that weren't taught in normal automotive programs challenged Jake's understanding of what was possible within the constraints of civilian restoration work. More troubling was Bob's references to field repair techniques and improvised solutions that suggested experience with equipment maintenance under conditions that civilian mechanics never encountered. "I've been rebuilding transmissions for 20 years, and I've never seen repair approaches like what you're describing," Jake protested, his professional skepticism evident in both voice and body language. "The case welding techniques you're proposing require equipment that most shops don't have, while the internal component modifications you're suggesting could affect gear timing in ways that might not become apparent until the transmission fails under load. I'm not comfortable signing off on repairs that use methods I can't verify through normal industry sources." Bob's patient explanations of his proposed transmission repairs included technical details that Jake had to admit were sound in theory, but the source of such specialized knowledge remained mysteriously hidden behind deflections that were becoming increasingly frustrating. Bob's obvious understanding of transmission mechanics that went far beyond normal civilian training, combined with his references to problem-solving approaches that seemed more appropriate to emergency field conditions than civilian restoration work, suggested background and experience that didn't match his modest demeanor and claimed civilian career. The conflict reached a critical point when Eleanor's mechanics threatened to refuse collaboration with repair methods they couldn't understand or verify. Tommy and Jake's professional reputations were tied to restoration approaches that followed established industry practices, while Bob's unconventional techniques represented risks that could damage their standing within the regional automotive community if Eleanor's restoration failed spectacularly. The impasse threatened to derail Eleanor's restoration completely, leaving Mike Henderson with a project that professional mechanics had abandoned and an amateur whose methods they couldn't endorse. Dorothy Henderson's visit to the shop during the height of the conflict provided unexpected insight into the dynamics that were frustrating Eleanor's mechanics. Her quiet observation that Bob had always possessed knowledge and capabilities that seemed beyond his claimed civilian experience suggested that the current situation reflected patterns that had persisted throughout their marriage. Dorothy's careful way of discussing Bob's hidden depths, avoiding specific details while acknowledging their existence, implied that she understood her husband's background included elements that weren't compatible with normal civilian mechanical work. "Bob has never been comfortable talking about where he learned what he knows," Dorothy explained to Eleanor during a private conversation about the growing tension between Bob and the shop's mechanics. "Even with me, after 52 years of marriage, there are aspects of his past that he keeps private. What I can tell you is that he's never claimed expertise that he didn't possess, never undertaken projects that he couldn't complete successfully. If he says he can fix Eleanor, then he probably can, even if his methods seem unusual to people who learned automotive repair through conventional training." Mike Henderson's position as mediator between his grandfather and Elena's mechanics was complicated by his own lack of technical expertise and his desperate need for Eleanor's restoration to succeed. The financial pressure created by Lisa's medical bills, combined with the approaching deadline of the car show, meant that Mike couldn't afford to abandon the project regardless of the conflicts surrounding Bob's unconventional methods. His faith in his grandfather's capabilities was based more on family loyalty than technical understanding, while his awareness that conventional approaches had already failed made Bob's mysterious expertise his only remaining hope. The resistance to Bob's methods also reflected deeper concerns about professional identity and the source of legitimate expertise. Elena's mechanics had invested years in learning restoration techniques through established channels, building reputations based on mastery of conventional approaches that followed industry standards and used commercially available equipment. Bob's obvious capabilities threatened the assumption that professional training was necessary for advanced automotive work, while his evasive explanations about his background suggested that legitimate expertise could be acquired through channels that weren't available to civilian mechanics. More troubling was the implication that Bob's knowledge had been acquired under circumstances that weren't compatible with normal civilian life. His references to time constraints and resource limitations that didn't match typical restoration work, combined with his familiarity with equipment that wasn't available through conventional channels, suggested training and experience that raised questions about the nature of his background. The growing suspicion that Bob was hiding military or industrial experience that he preferred not to discuss added layers of complexity to conflicts that were ostensibly about technical approaches to automotive repair. The confrontation that would finally force Bob to reveal the true source of his expertise was building toward an inevitable explosion, as professional skepticism combined with time pressure and financial desperation. Elena's mechanics couldn't continue to work alongside someone whose methods they didn't understand, while Bob couldn't explain his techniques without revealing background information that he'd spent 70 years protecting. The silence that descended on Martinez Classic Restorations carried the weight of 7 decades of carefully buried secrets, as Bob Henderson stood motionless beside Eleanor's exposed engine, his weathered hands gripping a diagnostic instrument that had never before been seen in civilian automotive applications. The argument between Tommy Chen and Jake Williams had reached its peak.
Professional frustration manifesting in accusations that questioned not just Bob's unconventional methods, but his right to attempt repairs that had stymied them combined 25 years of restoration experience. Elena Martinez found herself paralyzed by indecision, torn between the mounting evidence of Bob's extraordinary capabilities and the professional responsibility she bore to protect her shop's reputation from techniques that defied industry standards. The breaking point came when Tommy physically stepped between Bob and Eleanor's engine block, his voice rising with indignation that had been building throughout the morning. "I've been restoring classic cars since before you started pretending to know about engines, old man. I'm not going to stand here and watch you destroy 8 months of professional work with garage sale tools and YouTube theories." The words hung in the air like smoke from burning bridges. Professional courtesy abandoned in favor of territorial protection that revealed the depth of Tommy's frustration with restoration challenges that had exceeded his expertise. Bob's reaction was instantaneous and telling, his entire posture shifting from accommodating grandfather to something altogether more formidable. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood the difference between civilian confidence and military bearing. A change that spoke of training acquired under circumstances where hesitation could prove fatal. "Son, you need to step aside," Bob said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that made everyone in the shop take notice. "This engine can be saved, but not if you insist on using methods that have already proven inadequate for the challenges we're facing." Mike Henderson watched his grandfather's metamorphosis with growing amazement and concern, recognizing for the first time that the modest retiree who had spent decades deflecting questions about his mechanical expertise was revealing depths of knowledge and capability that had never been visible during Sunday family dinners or casual conversations about automotive repair. The precision instruments that Bob had arranged around Eleanor's work area weren't hobby-level equipment. They were professional-grade devices that represented investment and expertise that seemed incongruous with his claimed background as a small-town civilian mechanic. Elena found herself studying Bob with new eyes as he began his approach to Eleanor's damaged engine block, his movements economical and precise in ways that suggested familiarity with procedures that went beyond typical civilian automotive experience. The diagnostic equipment that Bob deployed wasn't available through normal supply channels, while his systematic approach to pre-repair analysis followed protocols that Elena recognized from aerospace and military applications rather than conventional restoration work. More significantly, Bob's obvious confidence in techniques that seemed to violate established repair principles suggested that his knowledge had been tested under conditions that civilian mechanics never encountered. The first indication that Bob possessed capabilities beyond anything Elena had witnessed in 25 years of professional restoration experience came when he began his initial examination of Eleanor's cracked engine block using instruments that revealed damage patterns invisible to conventional inspection methods. His modified ultrasonic testing equipment detected stress concentrations that Tommy's previous analysis had missed, hairline fractures that explained why standard repair attempts had failed, while suggesting approaches that could potentially restore structural integrity that professional machine shops had declared irreparable. Jake Williams found himself drawn to Bob's methodical approach, despite his initial skepticism about amateur involvement in problems that had defeated professional restoration experts. The elderly man's understanding of metallurgical failure patterns went far beyond normal automotive training. His analysis included factors that Jake had never considered despite 20 years of transmission rebuild experience. Bob's casual references to stress analysis and material science suggested engineering knowledge that seemed more appropriate to military or industrial applications than typical civilian mechanical work. The fracture propagation follows crystalline boundaries that indicate thermal shock loading combined with vibrational stress, Bob explained, his weathered hands tracing crack patterns that Tommy had dismissed as random damage requiring complete engine replacement. This kind of failure signature suggests the block was subjected to extreme temperature cycling while under operational load, probably during sustained high-performance operation that exceeded design parameters. The repair approach needs to address both the visible damage and the underlying metallurgical conditions that allowed the fractures to develop. Tommy Chen's professional pride was wounded by Bob's implicit criticism of previous diagnostic work, but his growing fascination with analysis that exceeded anything he'd learned in formal training prevented him from walking away from a demonstration of expertise that challenged his understanding of what civilian mechanics could know. The instruments Bob was using cost more than most restoration shops invested in diagnostic equipment, while his systematic approach to damage assessment followed procedures that Tommy recognized from aerospace manufacturing rather than automotive repair applications. The transformation of Bob from accommodating grandfather to confident technical expert was most visible in his handling of precision equipment that required familiarity born of extensive experience rather than casual exposure. His operation of modified welding apparatus included adjustments and calibrations that spoke of training in applications where failure carried consequences that civilian mechanics typically didn't face. Elena began to suspect that Bob's background included experiences that his modest explanations couldn't adequately account for, knowledge acquired under circumstances that weren't compatible with normal civilian mechanical training. Dorothy Henderson's arrival at the shop during Bob's initial welding attempts provided additional insight into mysteries that had shaped their marriage in ways that even she didn't fully understand. Her lack of surprise at seeing Bob demonstrate advanced technical capabilities suggested that she'd witnessed similar displays of hidden expertise throughout their 52 years together, knowledge that Bob had kept private for reasons that Dorothy had learned not to question too persistently. Bob has always been able to fix things that other people couldn't, Dorothy told Elena during a quiet moment while Bob prepared his welding equipment with obvious familiarity and taking a call on a well-known satellite connection.
Familiarity. Even when we were first married, he had tools and techniques that seemed beyond what his job required. I learned early in our relationship that some aspects of his past were subjects he preferred not to discuss in detail, experiences that were better left unexamined for everyone's peace of mind. The systematic approach that Bob employed for Eleanor's engine block repair revealed planning and methodology that went beyond casual mechanical tinkering. Systematic documentation of procedures that suggested training and quality control methods that weren't taught in normal automotive programs. His obvious familiarity with metallurgical testing and verification procedures implied background knowledge that exceeded typical civilian technical education, experience with critical applications where failure carried consequences that hobby-level work never encountered. Mike Henderson's growing realization that his grandfather possessed knowledge that went beyond typical civilian mechanical capabilities was both exciting and unsettling, raising questions about Bob's background that had never occurred to him during decades of family interactions. The transformation of his modest grandfather into someone who could perform advanced metallurgical analysis using equipment that most professionals couldn't afford to maintain was difficult to reconcile with Mike's understanding of Bob's claimed civilian career path. The precision welding work that Bob began on Eleanor's engine block demonstrated control and technique that exceeded anything Tommy had witnessed in 15 years of professional restoration experience. The fusion characteristics Bob achieved using modified equipment showed penetration and heat-affected zone properties that Tommy associated with military or aerospace applications, rather than typical automotive repair work. More significantly, Bob's obvious satisfaction with results suggested that he was achieving exactly what he'd intended, confidence based on extensive previous experience with similar repairs under different circumstances. Elena Martinez found herself caught between professional curiosity and growing concern about the implications of Bob's obvious expertise. The equipment he was using, the techniques he was demonstrating, the systematic approach he was following, all suggested training and experience that weren't available through civilian channels. Her discreet inquiries about where such capabilities could be acquired had yielded frustrating results, with suppliers claiming that Bob's level of expertise exceeded what was typically accessible to civilian mechanics. Jake Williams's skepticism about Bob's transmission repair proposals began to dissolve as the elderly man's engine work produced results that exceeded professional machine shop capabilities using techniques that weren't taught in civilian programs. Bob's understanding of component relationships and stress interactions suggested knowledge that had been acquired through direct experience with equipment that operated under conditions that civilian transmissions never encountered. The successful completion of Bob's first welding pass on Eleanor's engine block created a moment of stunned recognition throughout the shop. Professional skepticism replaced by grudging acknowledgement that amateur mechanic was demonstrating capabilities that exceeded established industry standards. The fusion line Bob had created showed characteristics that Elena recognized from high-end manufacturing applications, quality that required equipment and expertise that most civilian shops couldn't afford to maintain. Frank Martinez's surprise visit to examine his daughter's claims about remarkable engine repair work provided additional validation of Bob's obvious expertise from someone whose 40 years of restoration experience had taught him to recognize quality regardless of the methods used to achieve it. Frank's assessment of Bob's welding work was both technical and practical, drawing on decades of professional experience that had exposed him to a wide variety of repair techniques and quality standards. I've been in this business since the early 1970s, and I've never seen cast iron repair work that approaches this level of precision, Frank told Elena during their examination of Bob's initial results. The heat input control required to achieve this penetration without causing thermal distortion suggests training that goes far beyond normal automotive education. Whoever taught this man these techniques learned them under circumstances that civilian mechanics never encounter.
Academic interest in Bob's techniques led to her request for permission to examine Eleanor's repaired engine block in person. Scholarly curiosity about metallurgical procedures that seemed to exceed civilian capabilities, driving her willingness to travel from University Park to Millbrook for first-hand assessment of work that challenged her understanding of what restoration techniques could accomplish.
Her professional reputation in metallurgical research provided additional validation of Bob's obvious expertise from source that couldn't be dismissed as automotive industry bias. The regional automotive press began taking notice of Eleanor's restoration when Pennsylvania Classic Car magazine received tips from industry contacts about remarkable engine repair work being performed at Martinez Classic Restorations. The magazine's technical editor, James Morrison, was initially skeptical about claims that amateur mechanic had achieved results that professional restoration shops couldn't match. But his examination of photographs and documentation convinced him that Bob's work deserved serious journalistic attention. What we're seeing here challenges conventional understanding of what's possible in civilian automotive restoration, Morrison wrote in his preliminary article about Eleanor's engine repairs. The techniques being demonstrated exceed anything I've encountered in 20 years of covering the classic car industry, suggesting that this gentleman possesses knowledge and capabilities that go far beyond typical hobby-level mechanical experience. The publicity that Eleanor's restoration was attracting created unexpected opportunities for Elena Martinez, whose shop was receiving inquiries from restoration projects throughout the region that had been abandoned by other facilities as too challenging for conventional repair methods. The professional recognition that Bob's work was generating was transforming Elena's business from local restoration shop into destination facility for projects that required capabilities beyond established industry standards. Tommy Chen found himself fielding phone calls from mechanics throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states who had heard about the remarkable engine block repairs being performed under his observation. The attention was both flattering and embarrassing for Tommy, who had initially opposed Bob's involvement, but was now witnessing results that exceeded anything he'd achieved using conventional restoration techniques. His growing respect for Bob's obvious expertise was complicated by professional curiosity about the source of knowledge that civilian training couldn't explain. I've had to completely revise my understanding of what's possible in cast iron welding, Tommy admitted to a colleague during one of many phone conversations about Bob's techniques. The methods he's using aren't taught in any civilian program I know of, but the results speak for themselves. Whatever background this man has, wherever he learned these procedures, he's demonstrating capabilities that challenge everything I thought I knew about automotive metallurgy. Jake Williams's experience paralleled Tommy's transformation from skepticism to amazement as Bob's transmission work progressed with the same systematic precision that had characterized his engine repairs. The case welding techniques Bob employed exceeded anything Jake had encountered in 20 years of professional restoration, while his understanding of internal component relationships suggested training that wasn't available through conventional civilian channels. The precision instruments that Bob continued to use throughout Eleanor's restoration drew attention from equipment suppliers and technical representatives who visited the shop to examine tools that weren't available through normal civilian automotive channels. The modified welding apparatus, the specialized measuring devices, the metallurgical testing equipment all represented investments in capability that seemed disproportionate to typical civilian restoration work while suggesting access to resources that most mechanics couldn't obtain. Mike Henderson's pride in his grandfather's remarkable achievement was mixed with growing curiosity about the source of expertise that had saved Eleanor from certain failure. The transformation of Bob from modest retiree to acknowledged expert in advanced metallurgical repair had revealed depths to his grandfather's background that Mike had never suspected, capabilities that raised questions about experiences that Bob had kept hidden throughout Mike's lifetime. The professional recognition that Bob's work was receiving extended beyond local automotive community when representatives from classic car auction houses began expressing interest in Eleanor as example of restoration techniques that exceeded industry standards. The potential value of Shelby that had been restored using innovative methods could far exceed typical market prices for similar vehicles. Financial validation of Bob's expertise that complemented professional acknowledgement of his remarkable capabilities. Dorothy Henderson's reaction to the attention that Bob's work was receiving reflected decades of living with someone whose capabilities had always exceeded his willingness to explain their source.
Her quiet pride in Bob's obvious expertise was tinged with concern about scrutiny that his demonstration of advanced skills would inevitably attract, questions about his background that she'd learned not to ask but that others might not be so diplomatically inclined to avoid. Elena Martinez found herself in the unusual position of having to explain to other restoration professionals how amateur mechanic had achieved results that her own trained staff couldn't match using conventional methods. The attention that Eleanor's restoration was attracting throughout the regional automotive community was beneficial for her shop's reputation, but it also raised questions about Bob's background that Elena couldn't answer satisfactorily while respecting his obvious preference for privacy about the source of his remarkable expertise. The documentation that Bob maintained throughout Eleanor's restoration process revealed systematic approaches to quality control and metallurgical verification that weren't typical of civilian automotive work, procedures that suggested training in methods that weren't taught in normal mechanical programs. His obvious familiarity with precision measurement and statistical analysis implied engineering knowledge that went beyond typical trade school education, while his systematic approach to problem solving suggested experience with critical applications where failure wasn't acceptable under any circumstances. Dr. Webb's visit to examine Eleanor's restored engine block provided academic validation of Bob's techniques from source whose expertise in metallurgical engineering couldn't be questioned by automotive industry professionals. Her detailed analysis of weld microstructure and mechanical properties confirmed that Bob's work exceeded conventional civilian capabilities, while raising questions about training and experience that seemed more appropriate to military or aerospace applications than typical restoration projects. The grain structure and fusion characteristics I'm observing indicate welding technique and parameter control that I associate with critical structural applications rather than automotive restoration, Dr. Webb explained to assembled group at Elena's shop. The precision required to achieve these results suggests training and experience that aren't typically available through civilian educational programs. Knowledge that has been acquired under circumstances that demand success regardless of available resources or conventional limitations.
Emotional anchor for Bob as he confronted memories and skills that he deliberately suppressed for reasons that had shaped their entire relationship in ways that even Dorothy didn't fully comprehend. The financial implications of Bob's commitment were equally significant for Mike Henderson, whose investment in Eleanor had evolved from childhood dream to family financial crisis, as medical bills and restoration costs accumulated beyond original budget projections that had seemed reasonable when Eleanor appeared to be a straightforward restoration project, rather than challenge that would test limits of conventional automotive repair capabilities and reveal hidden expertise that raised questions about Bob's true background and qualifications. The precision work that Bob was performing on Eleanor's transmission required hours of concentrated effort that would have challenged mechanics half his age, physical demands that tested limits of his 78-year-old body while requiring mental focus that drew on knowledge and experience that he'd tried to forget for decades, but that remained embedded in muscle memory and professional instincts that civilian life had never entirely erased despite his best efforts to maintain anonymity. Lisa Henderson's quiet presence during some of Bob's work sessions provided additional motivation for elderly man's commitment to Eleanor's restoration that extended beyond simple family obligation into territory of personal redemption and validation of expertise that had been deliberately hidden for reasons that were becoming increasingly difficult to justify under current circumstances. Her medical condition had created financial pressures that made car show prize money essential rather than simply desirable, while her obvious faith in Bob's ability to achieve impossible created emotional stakes that went beyond simple automotive restoration into realm of family salvation. The regional automotive community's growing attention to Eleanor's restoration added pressure that complicated Bob's commitment to completing project within show deadline that was attracting media coverage and professional scrutiny that transformed routine restoration into public demonstration of capabilities that exceeded conventional industry understanding. Phone calls from restoration professionals throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states, requests for interviews from automotive publications, invitations to speak at technical conferences all represented recognition that Bob had never sought and wasn't entirely comfortable receiving under circumstances that demanded explanations he wasn't prepared to provide. The commitment Bob was making also extended to Elena Martinez and her shop, whose reputation was now tied to success or failure of restoration methods that challenged established industry practices while providing opportunities for professional advancement that could transform regional restoration facility into nationally recognized center for advanced automotive techniques. The professional risk that Elena was accepting by allowing Bob to demonstrate unconventional methods using her facility and resources represented faith in capabilities that couldn't be verified through normal channels or validated by credentials that typical mechanics possessed. Dr. Margaret Webb's growing involvement in documenting Eleanor's restoration added scholarly dimension to Bob's commitment that extended beyond immediate family and financial concerns into territory of academic recognition and historical preservation of techniques that challenged conventional understanding of civilian mechanical capabilities. Her recognition that Bob's methods represented significant advancement of metallurgical knowledge provided intellectual validation that complemented professional acknowledgement of his obvious expertise while raising questions about training and experience that seemed inconsistent with his claimed civilian background. The transformation of Martinez Classic Restorations into something approaching precision manufacturing facility under Bob's guidance represented commitment to standards that exceeded normal civilian automotive work, while demonstrating capabilities that attracted attention from sources that couldn't be easily satisfied with modest explanations about hobby-level mechanical interest. The quality control procedures he was implementing, the documentation requirements he was establishing, the systematic approach he was demanding from everyone involved in Eleanor's restoration all suggested experience with applications where failure carried consequences that civilian mechanics never faced during normal service work. Part 9. External pressure mounts. The morning that external pressure began to seriously threaten Eleanor's completion started with unexpected arrival of investigators from Pennsylvania Department of Professional Licensing. Their official credentials and serious demeanor created immediate tension in Martinez Classic Restorations that had nothing to do with automotive repair and everything to do with regulatory compliance that could shut down operations entirely. The investigators claimed to be following anonymous complaints about unlicensed technical work being performed by individuals who weren't properly certified for sophisticated procedures that rumors suggested were being employed at Elena's facility. Official scrutiny that transformed comfortable working environment into something resembling interrogation. Elena Martinez found herself in an impossible position of trying to explain Bob Henderson's remarkable capabilities to investigators who were trained to identify regulatory violations rather than appreciate innovative solutions to challenging technical problems. The precision equipment that Bob had been using throughout Eleanor's restoration suddenly became evidence of potentially unauthorized activities, while his obvious expertise in metallurgical procedures that weren't taught in civilian programs raised questions about whether he possessed proper credentials for work he was performing with results that exceeded professional standards. The timing of the official investigation was particularly damaging because it occurred during critical final phase of Eleanor's preparation for Millbrook Classic Car Show, interrupting work that required absolute precision and concentration with bureaucratic procedures that treated advanced mechanical expertise as potential regulatory violation rather than remarkable achievement that deserved recognition and study. Bob's reaction to official scrutiny was immediate and concerning, his comfortable confidence replaced by obvious anxiety that suggested personal experience with circumstances where government attention carried consequences that civilian mechanics typically didn't face. Mike Henderson arrived at the shop to find investigators photographing equipment that his grandfather had
using to complete Eleanor's transmission calibration, their systematic documentation creating evidence file that could potentially be used to challenge work that had already exceeded professional restoration standards using techniques that weren't available through normal training channels. The transformation of Bob's remarkable achievement into potential regulatory violation was both surreal and terrifying, representing threat to Eleanor's completion that had nothing to do with technical challenges and everything to do with bureaucratic interpretation of unconventional methods.
The investigators' questions revealed knowledge of Bob's background that suggested someone had conducted research into his military service and civilian career, information that Bob had never discussed publicly, but that apparently existed in official records that could be accessed by people with appropriate credentials and motivation to investigate individuals whose capabilities exceeded typical civilian mechanical training. Their casual references to specialized training programs and technical capabilities that matched Bob's demonstrated expertise implied that his attempt to maintain anonymity throughout civilian life had been less successful than he'd believed. Tommy Chen and Jake Williams found themselves being questioned about repair techniques that they'd learned from Bob during Eleanor's restoration. Their responses documented as potential evidence of training that exceeded their official credentials and shop certifications that were designed to ensure public safety through verification of mechanical competence. The irony of being investigated for acquiring knowledge that had improved their professional capabilities wasn't lost on either mechanic, but implications for their careers and Eleanor's shop license created pressure that threatened to undermine collaborative atmosphere that had made Eleanor's restoration possible. Dr. Margaret Webb's academic involvement in documenting Eleanor's restoration had apparently attracted attention from sources that viewed her scholarly research into advanced metallurgical techniques as potentially relevant to regulatory concerns about unauthorized technical training and equipment usage that exceeded normal civilian capabilities. Her scholarly interest in innovations that challenged conventional understanding was being reinterpreted as evidence of systematic violation of licensing requirements that were designed to protect public safety through certification of mechanical expertise. The external pressure escalated when representatives from Pennsylvania State Police arrived to support licensing investigators, their presence suggesting that regulatory concerns had evolved into potential criminal investigation that could result in charges related to fraudulent representation of professional qualifications or unauthorized operation of educational facility that provided training beyond scope of Eleanor's current business licenses. Bob's obvious distress at seeing uniformed officers examining his equipment and methods revealed depths of anxiety that Dorothy Henderson had never witnessed in 52 years of marriage. Frank Martinez's attempt to vouch for quality of work being performed at his daughter's shop was complicated by investigators who questioned whether civilian automotive restoration should involve techniques and equipment that seemed more appropriate for military or aerospace applications than typical repair work that normal licensing requirements were designed to regulate. The precision instruments Bob had been using, the metallurgical procedures he'd employed, the systematic approach to quality control he'd implemented, all were being reinterpreted as evidence of activities that exceeded scope of normal civilian mechanical work. The investigation reached critical intensity when officials discovered that some of Bob's equipment hadn't been purchased through normal civilian channels, raising questions about how a retired civilian mechanic had acquired precision instruments that required special credentials to obtain from suppliers who served military and aerospace applications rather than automotive restoration facilities. The modified welding apparatus, specialized measuring devices, metallurgical testing equipment, all represented potential evidence of systematic violation of regulations designed to control access to technologies that could have security implications. Eleanor's attempts to explain that Bob's expertise had saved Eleanor from certain failure and demonstrated repair capabilities that exceeded anything her professionally trained mechanics could achieve were dismissed by investigators who were trained to identify regulatory violations rather than appreciate innovative solutions to challenging technical problems that conventional methods couldn't address. The transformation of remarkable mechanical achievement into potential criminal activity represented fundamental misunderstanding of the difference between bureaucratic compliance and practical expertise that could produce results when established approaches failed. The financial implications of the investigation were immediate and devastating for Eleanor's shop, as existing customers began canceling appointments and postponing projects rather than risk association with a business that was under official scrutiny for potentially unauthorized activities that could result in legal complications for anyone involved. The reputation that Eleanor had spent 25 years building within regional restoration community was being damaged by an investigation that treated advanced mechanical capabilities as suspicious rather than valuable contributions to automotive preservation and innovation. Mike Henderson's growing panic about Eleanor's completion was complicated by a realization that his grandfather's involvement in the restoration had created legal problems that could affect not just a car show deadline, but Bob's freedom and family's financial stability that depended on successful completion of a project that had evolved from a personal dream into a family crisis. The medical bills that had made Eleanor's restoration financially essential were now accompanied by potential legal expenses that could destroy everything Mike and Lisa had worked to build throughout their marriage. The pressure reached breaking point when investigators informed Bob that his continued work on Eleanor could be considered a violation of state regulations regarding unlicensed mechanical services, effectively prohibiting him from completing the restoration that had already demonstrated capabilities that professional shops couldn't match using conventional techniques that were taught in formal training programs. The bureaucratic interpretation of advanced mechanical expertise as regulatory violation represented fundamental contradiction between official compliance and practical problem-solving that could produce results when established approaches failed.
Produce results when conventional approaches failed. Dorothy Henderson's quiet strength became essential anchor for Bob as external pressure mounted beyond anything he'd experienced since returning from Korea 70 years earlier. Government attention that awakened memories and anxieties that he'd spent decades trying to suppress through civilian anonymity that was being destroyed by official scrutiny. Her faith in Bob's integrity and capabilities provided emotional support that enabled him to continue working despite investigation that treated his remarkable expertise as potential criminal activity rather than valuable contribution to automotive preservation. The investigation's expansion to include federal agencies created additional layers of pressure that suggested Bob's background included elements that were considered relevant to national security concerns. Military training and capabilities that apparently remained significant decades after his civilian transition despite his best efforts to maintain anonymity. The transformation of Eleanor's restoration from local automotive project to federal investigation represented escalation that Bob had never anticipated when he'd agreed to help his grandson save a childhood dream that had become adult obsession with consequences that extended far beyond family obligations. The external pressure was also affecting broader Millbrook community, as residents began questioning whether their quiet town was harboring activities that required federal investigation. Suspicion that threatened to destroy social relationships that Bob and Dorothy had spent decades building through careful cultivation of unremarkable civilian identity that was being shattered by official attention that made continued anonymity impossible to maintain under current circumstances. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.